Good evening, everyone. I'm going to give you a few minutes to log in while I do my intro. So welcome. If you are tuning in for the first time, this is the La Maison de Rouge Monday night weekly live broadcast. I am your host, Lucy Sweetkill, one half of the duo that is La Maison de Rouge. A little bit about who we are. LMDR is dedicated to expanding the BDSM experience by discussing, educating, and informing our audiences about the intersections of kink, wellness, sexuality, spirituality, and social activism. We aim to create a safe space for discussing these topics, as well as providing an avenue for our guests to share their stories and experiences. Thank you again for joining us tonight. Our guest is Keynote Speaker and author of the groundbreaking The Little Me Too book for men, as well as Remaking Manhood and the co-author of the Relational Book for parenting. He also writes and consults on relational practices, diversity and inclusion, and masculinity for organizations worldwide. In his words, his work is about our dominance-based hierarchical culture of masculinity. His focus is always on exploring how the denigration of the feminine leads to emotional disconnection for boys and men, and the resulting violence towards women this creates. Please welcome pronouns he, him, Mark Greene. Welcome. Thanks for joining us, Mark. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me.
We are very, glad to have you on. We've been wanting to have you on. We have your book at our play space. And so we're happy to have you here. As I think before we got on screen, we were speaking how it is very different from when we first met to how we're speaking today. So why don't we start with getting a little background information on you? Tell us your background in general,
Sure. Well, I spent a number of decades doing the sort of normative man box kind of life, right? Where I chased around after mortgage and money and jobs and this, that, and the other. And then 15 years ago, my son was born, and I ended up spending a lot of time as his caregiver. I mean, a lot. Like I was I ended up getting divorced. So for a number of years, I was his primary caregiver and his only caregiver. And this is a sort of a transformational experience for me. It taught me a lot about what I truly love doing versus what I had been doing for a long time. And as part of that process, I began to sort of ask myself questions about, sort of what the world had taught me about being a man and what the world was telling me now when I'd show up at the park at noon with my child and people would wonder what I was doing there. Like, why are you in a park with a child? What's wrong with you? And so the messages about masculinity that were coming really fast at me as an engaged caregiving father, I started to wonder what messages my son was going to be getting. And this led me into writing and speaking about masculinity and ultimately about a concept called Manbox Culture or Manbox masculinity, which has led to my work. And so now my life is basically dedicated to this question of getting further into that conversation. And that's what brings me here with you today.
So I want to ask you about some of these terms because I think some people are like, what does that mean, right? Mm-hmm. So before I say that, for those of you who are watching, if you would like to ask a question while we are having this conversation, you're totally welcome to do so. Please write it in the comment box and I will pull it on screen. So feel free to do that, but we will hold our traditional Q&A at the end as well for those of you who do want to wait to the end. So explain that term, man box culture, right? What does that mean?
Quite a phrase. Yeah. Okay, so there was a guy named Paul Kivel who in the early 1980s, he got involved with the Oakland Men's Project, and their goal was to try to understand the epidemic levels of violence against women in their community. So one part of that process for them is they went around to local high schools and they asked the boys in that high school, what are the rules for being a man? And what they discovered was there was a fairly consistent set of rules. Everybody knew them. And that set of rules sort of defined what it meant to be a boy or a man. And if you failed to live up to those rules, that little narrow boxed in view of being a man, then you would be policed back into that box via bullying or violence until you did it right. And I often ask groups when I'm presenting on this subject matter, I say, yeah, I'm going to tell you what the rules of the man box are. But before I do that, my guess is most of you can name them anyway, right? Or name some of them. And so I'll say, enter in the comment section what you think, some of the rules for being a man are. And what usually pops up is be tough, don't show your emotions, make a lot of money, have a lot of sex. And these are all parts of that man box structure. They're loosely associated with what would be thought of as traditional masculinity, but they really go far beyond that in a number of very limiting ways. But the rules of man box culture are, in fact, don't show your emotions, be tough, never show weakness, make money, don't be a caregiver, be a leader, always have the last word. And those come up pretty quickly for people, but there's a couple of more that they don't name as readily because they're a little uglier. And one of the uglier rules is be heterosexual, not homosexual. And another one is to have control over women and girls. A final sort of rule of man box culture is don't talk about anything deep. If you're going to talk to other men, talk about sex or money or cars or drinking, but don't talk about anything deep. So those are the rules of man box culture. And the challenge is that when we fail to do that correctly, imagine a 4-year. I mean, this conditioning begins in infancy, but if you see a 3 or 4-year-old boy fall down at the playground and scrape his knee and start crying, immediately everybody starts to look around and to see how long he's going to do that. And if he goes too long, a kid or his parents or his father, someone might say to him, hey, man up, man, be tough. Come on, you're all right. Shake it off. It's okay. And if he goes a little longer, they might say, what are you, a girl? What are you, a sissy? And in that moment, they name the feminine as what he is performing. And this expression of pain or distress by this male child is considered to be a feminine display. And that's the ugly sort of interlocking ironclad loop of man box culture, which is that we take this vast range of human capacities for expression, connection, things like empathy, again, caregiving, connecting, joy in relationships, all of that stuff, and we wrongly gender it as feminine. We act as if, the feminine half of humanity, that's their assets, which is wrong. It's purely human. And then whenever boys begin to display it, even at an early age, we begin to shame them by calling them sissies or girls or gay. So over the course of time, boys shut down emotional expression, which is where authentic human connection is located. It's located in the expression, the back and forth of relating. Yeah. And they shut all that down. So all they're left with to validate themselves is this culture of masculinity, which is hierarchical and domination based. So they get slotted into that. And all the men above them have the right to control and dominate them, and everybody below, they have to dominate. If they fail to dominate those below them, they move down in status, and that adds to the number of men who can give them grief. And this is a hierarchical dominance-based system instead of a more lateral masculinity of connection, which is what little boys have. They connect beautifully. They love each other. They're very affectionate. And there's a lot of research that bears all of this out. But the end result is boys end up completely disconnected and isolated. And the way that we train them, which is the denigration of feminine, they also end up with contempt for girls and women.
Yeah. I mean, that is, a lot of info, but exactly, I think a lot of people are shaking their heads and knowing, as you're saying this, I'm agreeing because we use these terms to make one better than the other, right? So you're doing this thing and I'm making fun of you, but to make fun of you, I'm using this term that exists, right? You're being a girl, right? So you're already noting that's negative,
right?
That's below. And so it's not surprising that when we use these terms, what else are, boys and men supposed to do when they see, they've been told that if you act like a woman, you're below. So what do you think how they're treating women? They're treating them as lower than, below than, right? So then from there, so is this what inspired you to write Remaking Manhood?
It is. And I can tell you a story. It has to do with the first time I encountered the work of a woman named Niobe Way. Niobe Way is here in New York City. She's at NYU, and she's been doing research for 30 years on boys' relationships. And she would go out to groups of boys, and she would ask them a simple question. She would say, "What does your best friend mean to you?" And she would ask this question the first time in early adolescence. She would say to boys, what does your best friend mean to you? And their response universally would include words like love. They would say, "I love my best friend." And the other thing they always said was, "Without my best friend, I would go crazy." Then 4 or 5 years later, she'd go back and interview the same boys again. And they'd say, "Yeah, my friend Mike, he lives around the corner, my best friend, but I don't see him that much anymore." Or, "Yeah, Mike, I see him sometimes. He's a great basketball player. No homo." They'd throw that in, no homo. And ultimately, what she discovered was that by late adolescence, boys had been convinced to care not about who they are authentically in relationship with others, but instead they had been convinced to prove what they are not, which is little kids, girly, or gay. And in that moment, they had disengaged from these friendships. They'd been talked out of this sort of joyful connection they had earlier with other boys. And at that point, boys' rates of suicide become 4 times that of girls. So what we're talking about is a system which, again, cuts boys off from connection and forces them to get into this hierarchical structure of masculinity. And this goes a long way to explain what happens to a lot of white men as they age out. Because we're talking about a hierarchy, right? A pinnacle. And at the very top of that is going to be white men. They are arguably at the top of that pyramid of power. So arguably, they should be having the most benefits that are possible to accrue from that kind of a system. And yet, when we look at suicide numbers, we see that 75% of them are older white men. So whatever it is about that system they've been gamed into thinking they have to play, ultimately it leaves them with lives that are empty and disconnected. And I had that sneaking, weird, haunted, empty feeling for decades, and finally decided I wanted to understand what happened. Where did that sense of joyful connection that I had as a young boy go? Why is our narrative always, I had it, but it's gone and I don't know where it went? This sense of belonging in the world and connection and compassion and community and all of these things that men are constantly looking for, sometimes in the wrong places.
Yeah. I think, I think our conversation, before we went live actually talked about, the pandemic, which I think really relates to this. I think a lot of people and men, I think obviously everyone, but I think men are really noticing like without the distractions, right? Of being able to go outside, go to restaurants, hang out, watch sport, whatever, right? A lot of people staying home, a lot of those things that we would all do, right? Go out and do things. Now we're kind of sitting at home and having to be, right?
Yeah.
I feel like I've noticed a pattern amongst the men in my life, my male clients as well, that they're noticing how much connection they don't have when they're not distracted with all the doing, right? So I feel like it falls really in line of what you're saying, because I think people are starting to notice that, like, oh, wait, I don't have any like friends where I could talk to deeply about the things that are going on in my life. Yeah. I wanted to ask about, so do you have a theory around kind of how this has come about in our society? Have you gone down that road to think about like, why why do we have this culture right now?
Right.
Like this male culture
Yeah,
of
but
disconnection.
to a degree, there may be a correlation with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution when men came in off the farms where they would spend all day with their families doing the, sharing the work. We didn't gender work in the home in those days like we do it now. Now it's extremely clear and demarcated, what is considered women's work and what is not. And I, as a, in my relationship with my partner, Saliha Baba, is a couple and family therapy, and she's seeing a lot of these issues coming out of COVID, coming up with her clients as well in the work that she does, especially men starting to really struggle with this question of what am I in the world when these distractions have been taken away.
Yeah.
But because she's the primary breadwinner in our family, and I am responsible for most of the daily tasks associated with taking care of our son, who's 15, and most of the housework. So I clean the bathrooms, I clean the kitchen, I do the dishes, I cook, I do a lot of that stuff as well. And one of the things that struck me very, very much so is about that work is how invisible it quickly becomes to all the people around you. So I'm seeing it through the lens of what women were expected to take on. My mother's generation, my mother had 5 children. And I know with one child how much work that generates every day. How many tasks are just like doled out daily? That's 30 minutes. That's 15 minutes of my life. That's going to take an hour. This is going to take 5 children. And there was never any question of anyone helping her. And she was staring down this tunnel at ultimately over the course of 5 children. She's staring down this tunnel at 40 years of this, of cleaning toilets that people come in and just wreck again because her work is utterly invisible, right? Yeah. So these questions of what is work, what is effort, what is fairness, what is meaning, what is purpose, all of that rises up more and more when you step outside of, when a man steps out of the man box, or when a woman steps out of her expected roles. We're all wrestling with this question of what is decent and human in the world, right? And in the way that we take on tasks, do work. I mean, I have maybe 2 more years of looking after my son before he's going to be out in the world. And but for me, the man box culture question is the brutal assertion of roles and tasks for both genders. Yeah. And the rejection of the negotiated, connected, meaningful communication that human beings actually are quite good at.
Yeah. So how do we remake manhood?
Well, it's funny. That's one of the things that I tell people all the time is that masculinity should be pluralized. It should be plural. There should be as many masculinities as there are men who assign that gender to themselves and seek to perform it, right? Yeah. So the problem with Manbox culture is not that some of the actual rules of Manbox culture are just violent and nasty, but the idea that you're a breadwinner instead of a caregiver, well, if that's your preferred way, go ahead, that's fine. But the problem with Manbox culture is not necessarily that it's a set of rules that look like traditional masculinity. The problem is it's the only acceptable way, and the violence that's used to enforce it.
Yeah.
And the violence that's used to enforce it with women as well. And when you talk about you talk about generations of men who are disconnected. We have these narratives all the time that men don't know how to express their emotions, that men are not social, that my wife finds, all my relationships, I don't, or men have what are called relationships of proximity, where I'm just friends with the guys at the gym or the guys at work. And if I change my job, I just drop all those relationships and pick up the next ones because who cares? They're all the same, right? They're all surface level. We never talk about anything but sex and booze and women and cars. And I go and spend the night 3 hours drinking with my friends, and I don't know any more about their personal lives than I knew when I got there. And this is a massive and epidemic level of social isolation playing out right before our eyes. And because we can drive around our cars and play our music loud, we think we have rich lives. So when we talk about COVID, now we're sitting in our houses and we're still thinking about How can I stimulate myself or self-medicate with drugs or sex or whatever in order to avoid this sense of emptiness that's at the heart of who I am? Cigna did a study in 2018, and what they found out was that 1 out of every 2 Americans describe themselves as feeling sometimes or always alone. Now that's a catastrophic. That's 130 million people. That's a catastrophic level of social isolation. And Lucy, when people are that lonely, it has a health impact of smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. It increases your likelihood of heart disease and neurodegenerative diseases, Alzheimer's, even cancer. People with cancer who are lonely, the cancer metastasizes faster. So we're talking about an epidemic of disconnection. It's informing our hate politics. It drives boys and men into this reactive space about women and people of color and LGBTQI people. It grows the ranks of white nationalists. It's literally, we're like animals, like dogs tied up in the back of the yard, right? We're so out of connection. We have no community. And if you take a social animal like a dog and chain him up in the back of the yard, he's just going to howl back there. And I would say that's as good a metaphor as any for many, many men.
Yeah, I agree. This is something like some people, there are obviously so many layers of things that have to be worked on in our very complicated society right now. But one of the, I get the question a lot, right? You dominate men, it must mean because you hate them, and it actually, and one thing I teach a lot when I'm teaching new doms is you cannot do this job if you hate men, because that's not what it's about. You actually have to feel connected to men and also feel a bit compassion, because there's so many men who come to see many sex workers in general because exactly that. They're lonely. They have no one else to talk to. They have no one else to open up to. And whatever they're into, whether it's their kinks, a fantasy, or whatever, they have no outlet for it. And it's so different from so many women that I know. Like when I'm feeling sad or any emotion, I've got like 6 people on speed dial. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like I've got groups and groups of women and men and different people that I can speak to openly, connectively. It's my support network, right? And the lack of support networks is a very foreign term for typical heterosexual men.
Yeah,
I would say. Support networks it's something they don't even know the words, or they haven't even thought about it and how important it is, right? And it's something that I see in my line of work, that I am their one connection. Literally, their one connection. And that's really tragic.
It is. It's difficult. It's not uncommon either, because when we talk about that story of Naomi Way, where men are trained out of connecting with their friends, these young men just entering into early adulthood, the other message society gives them is we give them a gentle push toward a girlfriend, and we say, if you want to have any kind of emotional relationship of any
She's
kind,
everything.
She's it. And this girl who's 17 years old or whatever, she's in no position to take on that level of emotional labor. But that's the solution. And God help you if you happen to be gay as a young man, because then that's not considered to be a solution for you. But there are organizations now doing men's work, and I'm a member of the Mankind Project, and that's one of them. There's Human, there's Everyman, there's a bunch of different organizations, and what we discover is that when men come and sit down in a room and sit in a circle and start sharing what's going on for them, we're very quick to open up and connect. So what it tells you is not that we don't know how to do that. It tells you that our culture has punished us whenever we did and made us hide that stuff away. And when men get a chance to finally find these, when I went to my Mankind Project weekend, and when I had my moment on the carpet, as they call it, when I'm supposed to be speaking my truth about my own challenges in life, what I said was, given the history of the men in my family and the boys and men I grew up with, and the way it is, I don't like men, I don't trust men, I hate men, and I'm sick of being alone. And that was the statement that I made in that moment. And I had to own the fact that I didn't trust men, that every time I came into a room with them, I was checking around to see what the pecking order was going to be and how we were going to line up on each other and who was going to do the microaggressions more and less and all that crap. But eventually I found, through the work with the Mankind Project, I found a community of men who care about connection more than they do about status or roles or any of that stuff. And and so any man watching this, regardless of how you perform masculinity, any way, shape, or form, if you lean into a gender fluid performance, whatever it is, and I publicly state that I am a gender fluid person across a lot of different definitions of gender. But whatever your way is, the Mankind Project has a space for you to begin to connect with other men and find that community of connection. And there is a ton of health data out there that tells us that men who do not have a circle of robust male companions, friends they can rely on for support, have the same levels of health risk, dramatically higher heart disease, etc., as men who are completely alone or men who are married. It's not enough to be married. It's not enough to be in a single meaningful relationship. You need that larger community of connection. And men can find that, but you have to decide you're sick to death of the isolation that we've been sort of bullied into.
Yeah, there was a comment about competition, right? Having connection compared to competition, because it is that. I think it's very common what you said about, there are a lot of, I've heard that same thing. I don't, from men saying, I don't like other men, I don't trust other men.
Absolutely.
Because it's a competition thing. It's like, you don't know if someone's going to, like, it tends to be competing of some kind or status compared to like, hey, genuinely, I want to get to know you. And I think that type of behavior has also bled into competitiveness over women, that women have, right? I very much think this is a very patriarchal kind of, I guess, experience, right? Is that, a lot of women feel competitive to each other because in so much of the patriarchal culture, they're kind of, pitted against each other with men, oh, she's prettier, this, that, she's more interesting. And so, it's really interesting having, the reason why we wanted to have you on, because some people are like, well, this is not kink related, right? But we're femdoms, and so we definitely believe in a female domination. But in general, within our own, we love the femdom. But more than anything, it's about having everyone on a level where they can connect, whatever position you choose, whether you are more dominant male or whether you're more submissive male or whichever, right? You can still have connection and you can still, appreciate each other. And I think this conversation is really important because I think a lot of the men who do tune in, they question their masculinity because they're told that, oh, well, because I want to be submissive to a woman here and there, or because I am interested in these gender fluid or sexually fluid activities, I'm not a man, right?
Right.
And so I think this is a really important conversation to have, that doesn't define you as a man.
Well, and the thing to understand is that when you talk about Manbox culture, you're talking about a very narrow set of rules. And what that comes down to is that pretty much every man out there when we spend our time proving we know how to make money or have sex or get drunk or talk about cars, what we're really talking about is that we have to hide away significant, authentic portions of who we are because they don't fit in. So you're talking about a process by which you do this surface level relationship while you also actively alienate yourself from yourself. And in that process, there's a lot of shame, right? This piece of me, I'm ashamed of it because I've been bullied every time I've come close to showing it. And therefore, it becomes a source of shame for us. In other words, we're trained out of hearing our true voice, our true self, and instead trained into performing something that we suck at because it's not authentic to us, which is this narrow set of doing, right? Making money, having sex, getting drunk. These are all about doing. They're not about being. And in the moment that we collectively come to understand that all of this then creates immense anxiety for men, which translates into the expression of anger. That's the one emotion we're allowed to do. And beyond that, the expression of anger toward women, which is political violence and economic violence and physical violence. The larger culture of masculinity, of Manbox culture, is killing all of us. This is a serious, serious issue. And if we can create instead a masculinity of connection where men can place themselves on a vast spectrum, whether that's in the sexual context, whether that's submissive or not, in the social context, whether that's a caregiver or a wage earner, where we can find what is a natural fit for us, then we don't have to come to our lovers and to our partners with this shame that so many men do. We come with shame. We arrive with this shame at showing our need or our pain or our loss. And I imagine in your community, that shame can look like self-loathing, right? Which is a very difficult thing. But I, as a man, have carried that self-loathing to my partners and admitted it over and over until I broke those relationships. So we all have a collective responsibility to heal ourselves and to start creating connection, but also just start finding places in the world where we can put ourselves where we are authentic.
Yeah. And I think that really, the authenticity really applies to everything and everyone. Mm-hmm. So what would you say in regards to, like, what are some steps that we should be taking, that either it's society or men, what are some steps in helping remake and reevaluate, our idea of manhood?
Yeah. Well, I will say this. I think younger people are getting on this very quickly. Their view of gender and their view of sexuality and their view of race is much more evolved. So I think the change is coming, but ultimately, there's still going to be millions and millions of families who train their sons up in these really violent hierarchical ways of performing masculinity. And sooner or later, each one of us who have grown up in that way need to go ahead and commit to doing our work as men. And this is not, don't find a relationship that'll help you fix this. It's not about that. Those are valuable. But it's to really decide, I need to go and join a group of men and do this work. Because ultimately, like if you look at the white nationalist movement, or you look at the angry, violent men that take action these days, I mean, the storming of the Capitol building was predominantly men who felt the election had been stolen. And this is one way of naming a victimhood frame, right? We're victims. Men are victims.
Yeah.
And we often use that victimhood as a reason to be violent, as a reason to be aggressive. We victimize others while telling them we are the victim. Yeah. So this cycle of abuse and violence has to be dealt with by men. We have to take our own work, find a way, a group or a therapist or a group of men in a men's organization, whatever you need to do. But it's time to really do that hard work. And we all our lives, because we're not allowed to express emotionally, because that's shamed in men, we haven't learned to self-reflect. because self-reflection is the processing of emotions, right? That's how we do that work. So for us, when we look internal, we get deep discomfort and maybe revulsion and frustration and anger almost instantly. So when you criticize a man's masculinity or his behavior in the world, he goes ballistic right away because you're asking him to take a look at himself. And that's the one thing we've been blocked from doing. We got to do the work, though. Men have to do this work in order to find peace, in order to find love and joy and hope in the world. And I didn't do my work until I was in my mid-50s. That's how long I spent half a century playing this other game of shame and chasing the dollars and chasing status and all the time feeling like a fake, feeling like I'm not enough in any way, shape, or form. And I know a lot of men feel that, and I want to invite you to do your work in whatever way you can and get free of that, because it is crap. It is crap.
I have a question. Someone asked, could you talk about ways that straight men can challenge these assumptions to make change?
I think, well, for me, the transformative act is to do the work for ourselves first. Because when we do the work, we behave differently, right? We simply present a different way in the smallest community we're in, which is our own family or our own circle of friends. And that the larger public performance of that, I mean, it may sound stereotypical, but I lean into sort of the ideas of diversity and inclusion work, because that's political work, right?
Yeah.
When you are out in the world, in your workplace, wherever. A classic example that people talk about all the time is you're in a meeting and a woman speaks up and someone speaks over her, or she gives an idea and the next guy says the same idea and they credit him with that. Those kinds of actions are very sort of stereotypical, but they are powerful expressions. When you say, no, I think Cynthia was saying that before, weren't you? And Cynthia, that was Cynthia's idea. Cynthia just said that. Or Cynthia, you were speaking. Why don't you continue? I'm curious to hear more about your idea. And in that moment, we challenge this dynamic in the room that is oppressive, which is that whoever steamrolls the best is the controlling voice in the room.
Yeah.
I have another story for you if we have time, from a different book by a different author. Judy Chu at Stanford did research with Carol Gilligan, and out of that research, she wrote a book called When Boys Become Boys. And while Niobe Way was doing work with boys in adolescence, Judy did her work with boys in a pre-K class, right? So she went into this pre-K class and was in there for 2 years following this cohort of boys and girls. And so one part of her book, which is a beautiful book, When Boys Become Boys, a little boy who's 4 years old comes up to her and he says, Miss Chu, I'm friends with all the girls, but don't tell Mike, the head of the boys club, because if you tell him, he'll kick me out of the boys club and I won't have a club anymore. Now that story is like, but there are issues there that are deep-seated and really, really unnerving. And the issues are this: you have a 4-year-old boy who's already aware of who the alpha is in his cohort, and he's already beginning to hide authentic aspects of himself and performing a version of masculinity that'll keep him in good with that particular group. So he's no longer going to be dialoguing or connecting across difference, which is with girls. And what Chu talks about is, she says there's just evidence, daily evidence, of boys beginning to hide their emotional acuity and beginning to take on these sort of stereotypical performances of masculinity. And that's in a 4-year-old.
Yeah.
Actually, we're already feeding them this stuff about masculinity when they're infants. It's a lifelong thing. And because there's so much, I mean, it comes from parents, from brothers and sisters, from kids in the neighborhood, from teachers, from coaches, from priests, from television. I mean, we get this culture, we get dominated with this idea of hierarchical masculinity. We get hammered with it so consistently that it's almost invisible to us. It's just the air we breathe and the water we swim in. So by the time young men are entering adulthood, we have no idea there's a culture of masculinity that's taught us a bunch of stuff. We just see it as our identity.
Yeah.
And until men can differentiate between all of this stuff that was brought to us by every single human being in our lives and our own identity, put a little daylight between those two. It's in that little bit of daylight that we can start asking questions about what do we really authentically want in our lives? And why do we believe what we believe about women or manhood or ourselves? But there's no room to ask those questions because we think it's just us. We think this culture of masculinity is just, it's me. It's my identity. It's being a man, which is why when you challenge a man on his performance of masculinity, they get so reactive so quickly. That's why men are so angry about the term toxic masculinity. They think you're saying they're toxic.
Yeah.
They can't differentiate between the two. And more importantly, which is really incredibly challenging, is that men are very reactive when anyone criticizes masculinity who happens to be a woman or, a feminist or a liberal or whatever that is. But the reason they're so reactive, and they're not conscious of it, it's a complete disconnect, is that they've been beaten senseless for 20 years by the men in their lives about how they perform masculinity every minute of every day, microaggressions, actual aggression, over and over again until they perform this narrow little version of manhood. Hey, dude, how's it hanging, man? Let's party.
Yeah.
And they don't realize that they're already topped off on being told what to be. So when someone comes in and says, that thing you're doing, that's kind of, they're like, what? And that reactivity is our victimhood turning into a weapon against anyone who would ask us to challenge ourselves and think differently. So it's loaded. It's a loaded issue. It's loaded.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I've definitely seen that. Like, as you're saying this, I'm like, instances just popping up in my mind.
Yeah.
And just the terminology, like all the little terms we use, right? Don't be a pussy. It's just, we love like this, it's become this natural language that people use and say for both men and women, any gender, right? Mm-hmm. And we don't see how this language is very divisive. We don't see how this language is, toxic. So there's just like these layers and layers of, defensiveness that comes out because, the lack of self-reflection, right? Because you're kind of told you're not really supposed to self-reflect or process your emotions. So then there's a lack of it. And then it's, it's this snowball effect of like issues that become really hard to, untangle in a lot of ways. Yeah. I have there's another question. Do you see this reflected in laws that allow people to pay others to consensually beat one another bloody, but criminalize gentle sexual relations? So I assume, this is talking about like very heavy sports, but then, any type of sex work is highly criminalized.
God, our culture is so absolutely effed up in terms of, the war against drugs, the moral, the idea that you can legislate morality, but you cannot legislate white collar crime is madness, right? It's absolutely crazy. And I mean, the question is of course completely on the mark in terms of the question of so a man, let's just compare cocaine and crack cocaine, for instance. Cocaine, an expensive version of the drug, rarely got prosecuted. People who use the cheap version of the drug, because of the socioeconomic difference, were herded into, for-profit prisons at an incredible rate. This idea that any aspect of that equation, there is no part of it that is healthy. There's no part of it that is human. The same thing goes with sex workers, the idea that we cannot, we break men, we make them want things that they're told socially they may not have. And then we create a whole culture of violence around women where they're literally assaulted and abused 24/7. And then we try to figure out a healthy way to make sex work possible for women. And in that whole milieu, nobody's holding the violent parties accountable. We're simply arresting everybody else, which is, you've asked me a question that is out of my fucking ballpark because it's so vast and it's so frustrating. And I've never had to even try to come up with a response to that. But we have a completely backward system, and basically we traumatize the crap out of boys until they become violent men, and then we build a system around them to try and support that behavior.
Yeah, it's such a complex thing, right? Because I have lots of thoughts around, yes, we allow these male-dominated industries, sports, whichever, that really entertain violence to a high degree. But God forbid if a nipple shows, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's that layer of just that patriarchal, toxic masculinity where we're like, the things that men do are okay. The things that women do are not okay. And the women body. And then on top of that, I also think it has to do with our very conservative, overly religious, and there's such a mix of all these things going on. And you throw that all in a pot and we have all these issues that we have. Right?
Well, and I'll tell you something fascinating. I'll give you some data right now from Deloitte. Deloitte did a study, and what they found out about fully inclusive organizations, which is organizations with inclusive cultures, that means women, LGBTQ people, BIPOC, everybody equally participating in leadership on down.
Yeah.
The data they have now, it's been happening long enough that they can get data in terms of how effective those organizations are compared to organizations that are exclusively run by white men.
Yeah.
And what they found out was that those organizations are twice as likely to meet or succeed financial targets, 3 times as likely to be high performing, 6 times more likely to be innovative and agile, and 8 times more likely to achieve better business outcomes. And when you talk about 6 times the level of innovation, what you're talking about is not a hierarchical system where 200 white men all say, well, Bob's at the top and he says this is what we have to do, so that's what we're going to do. That whole yes man thing, right?
Yeah.
Instead, you're talking about 6 times the level of innovation in organizations that are more diverse. Now, let's back up 600 years, right? How many of the catastrophic challenges that still face Western or globally that face the human species might have been addressed by now had we been 6 times as innovative, by a factor of 6? Women and BIPOC people and LGBTQ people and gender fluid, occasionally they would be able to get into a position where they could show their genius and make a change that benefited mankind. But the headwinds they faced, whatever work they did was immediately, denied and taken by somebody else. But the headwinds they faced to try to get there means that millions of others, gifted, talented, remarkable human beings, never got a chance to help make the human race move forward. So we're talking about white male control of Western institutions of education, religion, the military, all of it, business, has held us back by a factor of 6. And where we would be today if we had done this inclusion model, which is why we're fighting so hard for it now at the corporate level. But corporations know now, they don't have a choice. If they want to be in business in 10 years, they better fix it. They better get all of these different voices in the room with equal emphasis, or they won't be as competitive, and they know it now, which is fascinating that corporate America is like pushing aggressively for inclusion in ways that would scare the crap out of most white nationalists. True.
Well, yeah, I think it's very true. The diversity, right? Maybe we wouldn't be in the level of the lack of compassion we've had for the environment, the lack of compassion for those who are marginalized. Things could have looked differently, and maybe a more win-win position for everyone compared to a win-lose position.
I have no doubt of where I stand on the question of inclusion, of creating opportunity for people who don't look like me or sound like me.
Yeah.
I believe my child, and should there be a grandchild, I believe their survival depends on it.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe I would be a happier person if I didn't have to look at the world run by white men anymore, because the outcomes have been terrible. They've been lousy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And my anger and my frustration at the fact that we're still seeing their power and influence playing out in the United States Congress. Still, it's getting better, but we're not there yet. I literally say, well, all right, is there a woman running? Because that's who the fuck I'm voting for. Because it's just that what we have right now is unsustainable. It's very dangerous, and we can see it playing out right now. We're running out of time. We're running out of time. If we don't get to that 6 times level of innovation pretty quickly, we're going to run out of time.
Yeah, because the reality is the Earth will keep going. We'll just not be able to survive.
Sure.
Yeah, whether we all kill each other, blow each other up, or Mother Earth says, you know what, I'm done with you, pass.
Yeah,
you're
finished.
You're finished. Like, next round.
Yeah, try again.
Round of evolution.
Let's see what the frogs can do.
Yeah. Because she will definitely do that.
Yeah.
I do want to open it up for questions from our audience. I know we've had a few. So here's a really great question. It was something I was going to ask as well, which is, do you have any books, articles, writings that have really influenced you?
Yeah, I have to say Niobe Way's work has really changed my view of my own experience as a man. The night that I first heard her, I literally collapsed in tears. I couldn't. It was like I realized in that moment how much had been taken from me. In terms of my own, I had a close friendship as a child. I have an article I wrote called "Why Do We Murder the Beautiful Friendships of Boys?" And that article came out of the night when I first heard her read from her work.
Wow, that's amazing. And any, do you listen to any podcasts or anything like that you want to put out there for people to kind of do some ongoing work themselves, things that they can do?
Yeah. I'm not podcasting. I'm not listening to podcasts much lately, but we are getting ready to launch one of our own called Remaking Manhood, and that's we're in conversation with a lot of men who are doing men's work, and so you can sort of hear what those stories are like. And Niobe's going to be on one of our episodes, and a guy named Ashanti Branch, who does a thing called the Million Mask Movement.
Yeah.
He was in the film. If you've ever seen the documentary "The Mask You Live In," which is about boys and men and about masculinity, that's a really powerful documentary, and he's in that.
I've heard of it.
Yeah, it's beautiful. So I would recommend that film as just a starting point to sort of understand what boys and men are up against and how much trauma they have to. I mean, the bottom line is the fundamental question that we just can ask anytime we want. And I know men are a source of extreme frustration a lot of the time, but what gets done to them when they are babies and little boys. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, when you watch 2 4-year-old boys playing together, and the joy and the connection and the gentleness and the hilarity and the caregiving, are you okay? I'm okay. Let's give a little hug. Let's do what young boys do together is a joyful human connection, unfettered by all of our complexity. But you have to ask yourself, how hard do you have to traumatize that boy? And for how many years do you have to do it to get him to give up that joyful connection? What does it take? And it takes a lot. It takes a lot of violence and a lot of abuse and a lot of shaming. So I would say The Mask You Live In, Niobe Way's book, Judy Chu's book, and keep an eye out for our podcast, Remaking Manhood. If you're curious about what the work sounds like and what men who are doing that work, how we talk. Yeah.
We actually, our play space has a bit of a lending library. So we have your book, which I know we have given out to a few clients.
Thank you for sharing it.
So we have another question, which is, do you think technology contributes to this, or is it solely people-based? What has caused this over a long period of time?
Hmm. The Manbox culture, or these ideas, Manbox culture is just a term that Kivel applied to something that predates him by generations, right? These ideas about masculine toughness and control and dominance and all of that came out of they well, as long as white men have been in control, which goes a way back. I mean, we talk about um, hunter-gatherer societies versus the first agricultural societies, and then they began to want to control land, and then war became a thing. I mean, I don't know how far back the roots of it are,
Yeah.
but it certainly isn't technology exclusively. Um, so that's the best answer I can give you to that.
Do you think technology right now is helping, hindering, neutral in sort of this fight that we're in sort of this change, right? Because you did mention, and I agree with you, the youth of today are much more fluid. It's very beautiful to see,
Yeah.
but obviously these generational learning, these generational things, even with all the technology, you're still dealing with immense amount of toxic masculinity at young ages. You've got
Yeah.
the idea of incels, which really I feel were really born out of technology, right? Hiding behind the screen and kind of just, saying all this stuff. Like, do you think technology is helping or hindering?
Technology represents a significant threat. If you look at the Southern Poverty Law Center, they have written some really good articles that basically say the following: that masculinity extremists, or that's a term that I use, but that male supremacists and white supremacists, if you do a Venn diagram, they're basically the same group. But the way that right now, the recruitment that's going on via the internet and via all sorts of content on the internet, vegan cooking shows that have a subtext about white nationalism, all of this recruitment. And there's a woman named Cynthia Miller Idris who just released a book called Hate in the Homeland. And she documents all the different kinds of recruitment techniques that are being used online to recruit disaffected young men and say, yeah, okay, so you're mad at women? Yeah, I get that. Yeah, women, what are you going to do with that? There's some other people you should be mad at. You should be mad at immigrants. You should be mad at people of color because they're just taking our job. This whole weird, creepy, digital, incremental recruitment of angry young men is what's causing the upsurge of white nationalism in America. So, and when you talk about incels are basically weaponized victimhood. That's basically when I talked earlier about victimhood, these people have weaponized it to the point where they believe that violence should be done based on their level of victimhood. And most Trump supporters, most of the people who are talking about far right, QAnon, all of that, they constantly, the drumbeat is, you've been victimized. Trump told them, you have been victimized. He used that phrase when talking to the people, when he was trying to convince people that the election had been stolen. So we have to understand that the internet is, Facebook, man, they have created this massive network of white nationalists and QAnon's becoming a religion, for Christ's sake. And it wouldn't have happened were it not for the internet.
Yeah.
So what we're talking about here is that side of it, which is terrible. But we're also talking about this conversation, Lucy, and the work that a lot of us are doing to try and drive a different story and a different conversation for men out there. And I think it's a pitched battle right now. It's a battle for the soul of our civilization in terms of whether we're going to keep moving forward to make everyone equal. I mean, that safety and equality under the law. For a woman to be able to walk down the street and never have to look over her shoulder. Until we get there, then the battle continues.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Someone has wants your thoughts on this. It seems like the struggle for inclusion and community transcends gender and really speaks to the human condition in modern society, which is the loss of community leading to alienation. Thoughts?
Yeah, most certainly. And when we understand that human connection is being trained out of half the human beings in America, that it's being trained out of boys and men, that's being shamed and trained. It's a miracle that men still connect. It's quite remarkable that it means so much to us that we push through all of this shaming and abuse and violence to still seek connection. The problem is we don't get to do the trial and error work over a period of 2-3 decades to learn how to express in nuanced, thoughtful ways, to learn how to read the emotions of others, to learn how to do this work of being in relationship. So our expressions tend to be blunt and kind of loud and because we've never done the work. We've never been allowed to. It's a trial and error process from the time you're born until you become a young man to learn to communicate in nuanced ways. So if half the population is being stripped of its ability to do these things, then it's no wonder that the larger culture is hamstrung, right? Is a little bit broken. And I don't think we were that good at it before. Before, we had much clearer reasons to care for our community, right? We all had to get the crops in, and we all had to help build the barns and all of that. So that having gone away is a thing. But I believe the human need for connection is just as strong as it ever was, perhaps stronger, because we're evolving away from sort of simpler metrics for being human. We're all getting more nuanced, interesting metrics, but we don't have the skill sets to do the communication around them yet. But we're learning.
Yeah, I agree. And doing the work, I think, I feel like that's a very common phrase coming out of my mouth. You need to do the work. You need to do the work. We all need to do the work for ourselves, whether it has to do with our own ideas of gender expectations. We have to do the work around our own sexuality, our own traumas, our own insecurities, our own communications, our relationships with others. These aren't things our society, and when I say society, American society I can speak to, that we don't really teach people, right? Our schools, we don't talk about communication. We don't talk about consent. We don't talk about these like deeper emotional skills and connection skills. There's no class on this. It's not until if someone chooses to go to college and then you happen to focus in that in your studies, but we don't give people a baseline of how to look at ourselves in different ways and how to communicate and the problems and feelings and conflicts we might come up with, especially during our most traumatic years for all of us, which are teenage years, right?
Oh, yeah.
Confusing years. And nobody gets the tools, and it becomes, and so I'm not surprised that, all genders, all identities are all out of whack because we don't teach people how to communicate and connect in a authentic way. Mm-hmm. We teach people to hide and to feel shame and feel insecure, and you have to follow these rules. And for any of us, right, the woman who speaks out, you're a bitch, you're bossy, right? Or the man who doesn't, right, who's not like grabbing at all the women, and of course, like, and I'm speaking in a heterosexual lens because that's truly what I can speak from, being a heterosexual cis female. And so it's so complicated and becomes even more layers once you are in any realm different from that mainstream, right? So
I would say that the rich reward of doing the work is that we begin to come out of isolation into connection. And human connection is like a glass of water in a desert. It is something we have gotten so used to not having that when we finally get it and realize what we've been missing, we don't go back. We stay in that space of learning how to do that, or how to be in connection with other people. And I would say to anyone listening to this that if you want to begin doing that work, if you're a man, the first thing you need to do is understand what happened to you, which is this cultural abuse. And then you have to actively seek out men who acknowledge what we went through and are ready to move on past it to find connection again. And that's really powerful. And when you treat, I have to also say that the people I have, whenever I meet anybody from the kink community, from the community that you're part of, Lucy, people are already thinking about this stuff way deeper than most. They've already had to self-reflect about some serious stuff in order to even learn to negotiate that, or what it means to take ownership of that part of themselves. So I think this is a very rich and powerful community in terms of beginning to make this part of the dialogue, right? That we have to do our work, and especially men can begin to learn how to connect with other men and form the community they need to take the heat off of women, right? Take the weight off of the women in our lives. So it's I think there's a lot of hope, and a lot of good things are happening. And if anybody wants this whole Manbox thing, the little Me Too book for men is 75 pages long. It lays out all of this and more, and sort of just defines what it is that happened to us and what we can do to move past it.
And for those of you, if you all look down, we have Mark's, website, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. So please follow, please get his book if you really want to dive deeper. So check it out below. Well, I feel like that was a great ending there, what you had to say, Mark. So I really want to, thank you for being a guest on our show. I think this was such an amazing conversation and very helpful and very appropriate right now. For those of you all out there, for joining us live, and then for those of you who will rewatch this, thank you for joining us on the La Maison de Rouge Monday night weekly live broadcasts. And if you would like to support what we do here, please look below our Patreon to support our work, as well as get one-on-one conversations with Dia Dynasty and I about kink, BDSM, and more. Thank you again, Mark, for joining us, and have a good night, everyone.
Thank you, Lizzie. It was a real pleasure.
Awesome.